The PC gave us computing power at home, the internet connected us, and mobile let us do it pretty much anywhere. Now generative AI lets us communicate with technology in our own language using our own senses. But figuring it all out when you're living through it is a totally different story. Welcome to Leading the Shift, a new podcast from Microsoft Azure. I'm your host, Susan Ettlinger. In each episode, leaders will share what they're learning to help you navigate all this change with confidence. Please join us. Listen and subscribe wherever you get your podcasts.
It's The Other Side of Midnight with Frank Morano.
This is The Other Side of Midnight. I'm Frank Morano. I'll tell you, of all the guests that I've had on over the course of the last 4 years or so, maybe longer than that, one of the guests that I've gotten the most reaction and the most response to was Dr. Dan Friedman. Not only because he's an accomplished pediatrician and medical professional, but because of the subject and the focus of his last book. He got into the world of Sir Arthur Conan Doyle. A lot of you are going to be familiar with Arthur Conan Doyle as the father of the Sherlock Holmes stories. Makes sense. But in our last discussion, Dr. Friedman made a pretty compelling case that maybe, just maybe, Sir Arthur Conan Doyle might have been Jack the Ripper. And that ignited a firestorm of response that I have been hearing about over the last year or so. Been trying to get him back for the last year, but he has been hard at work on a new book called Doyle's World, Lost and Found, The Unknown Histories of Sherlock Holmes and Sir Arthur Conan Doyle. I've read it. It is just as thought-provoking and just as fascinating as the last book. Dr. Friedman, it's great to have you back on the radio. Thanks for joining me.
Oh, thanks. Thank you so much for having me back on your show. I'm really looking forward to taking you and your listeners back in time to the incredible world of Arthur Conan Doyle, an author whose life was defined by a duality of nature.
In the last conversation that we had, you had a lot of our listeners convinced that Arthur Conan Doyle might have been or was Jack the Ripper, the infamous serial killer. Before we get into your work with Doyle's World, remind everybody, why might Arthur Conan Doyle have been Jack the Ripper?
Again, my interest with Arthur Conan Doyle and Jack the Ripper came from some very circuitous route. I didn't look into Jack the Ripper to find out who he might have been. I was studying Arthur Conan Doyle and his life, and I actually, as a pediatrician by trade, I was studying his childhood and early development, and I saw clues to his upbringing that caused me to really go into the history of his entire childhood with a fine-tooth comb. The things I found were pretty disturbing. The abuse he suffered during his early childhood, between the ages of 4 and 6, being sent out of his home, an alcoholic father, abusive. The school he went to abused him more than any other student they had. The rules at the school he went to, Stonyhurst, were very Spartan to begin with, and even there he says he was the kid that got beaten the most. I recognize he had a psychotic break at age 14, where he thought one of the prefects tried to kill him, which was not true at all. And then, of course, it was going into his behavior of beating people up in the streets, stabbing his roommate on the first day, getting into fights as a ship's physician. Yeah, everything he did was a belligerent, antisocial behavior. And that's what took me into looking into what other things he may have been doing, where other biographers said that his life was lost between the years 1887 to 1889. They don't know what happened to him, which just so happened to coincide, which I didn't know it at the time, with the Jack the Ripper crimes.
So a lot of folks listening know Arthur Conan Doyle as a name, primarily for his work with Sherlock Holmes. A lot of people, I think, probably have an idea that he had an interest in the occult. Beyond that, I don't think anybody knows too much about his life beyond his literary work. You just alluded to the fact that he was a ship's physician. Obviously, that means he was a doctor. What else do we know, putting the Jack the Ripper stuff aside for the moment? What else do we know about Arthur Conan Doyle's life that's not speculation, that's factual?
Well, Doyle himself was a knight of the Empire. He was, at the age of 40, decided it was time for him to volunteer for His Majesty's Army, and he became a volunteer on the battlefield and in field hospitals in South Africa. He also was a champion for spiritualism, where he would defend the honor of mediums who were being attacked by either the press or by scientific luminaries like J.D. Rhine or Ray Lancaster, at the cost of tarnishing his own reputation that he had. He was a historic writer as well as a writer of detective fiction, basically popularizing the genre, one that was started by Edgar Allan Poe, but he really got the detective genre to the masses. Brilliant, but he's also a photographer who had an interest in writing articles for the British Journal of Photography. And that's one of the reasons that led me to a little bit of the Jack the Ripper was, how does someone see at night? Whose eyes would be adaptable to seeing in pitch darkness, 12 midnight in a pitch dark alley? And of course, Doyle worked in dark rooms, and his eyes were ones that could adjust to dark light or the darkenings of rooms. And he also invented, in one of these articles he writes about, a lantern using a red muffler that he would have with him. And of course, some of the spottings of Jack the Ripper show that Jack carried a red muffler around his neck, like a scarf. Doyle was everything. He was an athlete. He could play cricket. He could play bowling. He could play football, soccer, and he was gifted at it. And he was also very reckless. I said that he was also a ship's physician in the Arctic, where we got into a fight with the ship's purser on the first day. He also went on a little voyage to Africa on the west coast, where he decided it would be a great thing to jump off a ship and swim with the sharks.
Wow!
Yeah, the guy was just. He could do everything, and he did everything. Nothing was ever going to hold him back.
My goodness. At 30 minutes after the hour, this is The Other Side of Midnight. My guest is Dr. Dan Friedman. In addition to his work as a pediatrician and assistant clinical professor at the Northwell-Hofstra University Medical School, he's also an author. His newest book is Doyle's World, Lost and Found, The Unknown Histories of Sherlock Holmes and Sir Arthur Conan Doyle. I want to cover some of the other things aside from Jack the Ripper, but recently I did an interview that a lot of our listeners, I think, have heard, in which I spoke with two researchers that seemed to make a pretty compelling case that Jack the Ripper was Aaron Kosminski, a migrant from Poland who worked as a barber. I know that you came at it not through a who's Jack the Ripper lens, but a who's Arthur Conan Doyle lens, but I'm sure those worlds have kind of intersected for you a bit. What do you make of that Aaron Kosminski theory?
There's a lot to go on with him. I mean, it wasn't what I was thinking about talking about, but then again, it is kind of medical, so we're going to go into that. Now, first of all, Jack the Ripper, to me, he fought 4 women, all street women, ages 40, in their 40s. These were tough women. They weren't 16-year-old little kids. Aaron Kosminski, what was he? Less than 100 pounds, short, flyweight. So let me see. If I would be a woman like these street fighting women, 2 of the women actually got into fights on the day of their death. One was in jail. One was all bruised up from a fight she had with other people. They were tough women. Kosminski, 100 pounds. To have the power and strength to subdue them. Remember, the Ripper victims did not scream out. None of them screamed out. There were no audible sounds. The Ripper killed some of these people with people around them. One outside of a social club where the slightest sound would have alerted someone. Another one outside of a household that had about, I think, 20 people inside of it, some of whom were already up. For Aaron Kosminski to be able to stranglehold those women being less than 100 pounds, I don't think he had the force to do it or the power to do it. And that's just pure physics. And Conan Doyle, 6 feet tall, powerhouse, could climb up water pipes with ease, who could climb up to the mast or a crow's nest, not even using his legs. Now, that guy has the power to do so. Now, also, just going back to genetics, which I did a little bit of genetic training during my medical school years, the evidence that they showed using a shawl, number one, the shawl that they have in question, they were using semen samples on it. Now, as far as I know, and all the Ripper experts know, these weren't attacks of rape. There should be no semen sample left behind on a scarf if you're looking at someone who didn't commit rape. So why they were looking for that in the first place, I do not know. And also the mitochondrial DNA that they were looking at from the one who was the one who was looking in the medical community today actually had first said it was like some rare type of mitochondrial mRNA, but it really wasn't. It was another quite common piece that's found in 99% of all people of European descent. So I just don't think the evidence that they were looking at was correct.
But it is possible. You're not necessarily totally closing the door on this, or are you?
I don't think. I just don't think a person that's 100 pounds could really hold down and in 5 minutes really hold down someone who's a street fighting woman with one hand, strangle them, and then put them to sleep, and then carve them up in 5 minutes with surgical skills. Doyle, when he was on the Arctic, I was mentioning as a ship's physician, he got booted off the job. They told him that he was really no good as a doctor. But you could come back as a sealer, and a sealer would learn how to flinch a seal, which means you would be able to carve up their bellies and abdomens with a knife within seconds and then tug their bodies back to a ship. Another thing I may have not told you on the last show was that Doyle, during medical school, was a laboratory assistant to William Rutherford. In that laboratory, he was dissecting dogs, and the procedure he used was the exact same procedure used at murder number 4 at the Ripper site. Wow. Yes, you basically cut the windpipe, which is cut the neck of the dog or the victim, then open the abdomen using a surgical technique. And you remember in murder number 4, there was the person who killed Catherine did not just go up and down. He actually circumnavigated around the belly button, a navel flap it's called. That's a surgical technique, not one that would be used in the heat of a crime when you're trying to just try to get out of there. It was surgically done, and there were holes poked into the liver of that 4th victim, and liver biopsies were being performed by Doyle when he was 18, 19 years old, back as a medical student. That procedure is the exact same procedure he would have been very familiar with and very capable of doing. Kosminski, no. He would have never have done a navel flap. That's a surgical procedure. It wouldn't have been in his wheelhouse. And again, being able to see at nighttime, being able to lure people to the darkest corners of an alley with an accent where his reputation would have been known, in the area of Whitechapel. Doyle's reputation, or a person that looked like Doyle, a handsome young man with money who could pay for a prostitute, that's a little bit different.
Gotcha.
And that's why I don't think Kosminski really fits the bill.
Gotcha. If you're just tuning in, this is The Other Side of Midnight. I'm Frank Morano. My guest is Dr. Dan Friedman. His new book is Doyle's World. So, Dan, why did you write Doyle's World? What was your focus in this book that you felt was unfinished or unexplored in your previous book?
Well, I wrote Doyle's World because I really wanted to get things out there that Doyle was a multifaceted person, that he wasn't just a writer of Sherlock Holmes, or, from the strange case of Dr. Doyle, he wasn't just a murderous soul who was really tortured as a child, who had all these other issues in his psyche. I wanted to show that he was a great writer, a spiritualist, someone who basically led a religion, someone who paid tribute to people that he loved, by putting them into stories as hidden characters, which was the Robert Louis Stevenson chapter and The Empty House with Grant Allen, that he had real medical training in the things he did as a physician, and that's really why I wrote Doyle's World.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Let's talk about Sherlock Holmes. You discussed the real-life inspirations for Sherlock Holmes. How did Doyle synthesize multiple influences into one cohesive, iconic character?
Oh, I love that question because so many people associate Sherlock Holmes with Joseph Bell, a professor that Doyle had during medical school. And yes, Joseph Bell is a large piece, but Doyle took so many other pieces of other people and put them into this Sherlock Holmes character. He had a Professor Littlejohn, who was one of the most celebrated people in Edinburgh and actually in Scotland for his medical legal expertise. And he was a great actor. And as we all know from the Sherlock Holmes stories, so is Sherlock Holmes. He goes in disguise. People will fall under his spell as either an asthmatic sailor. He can transform himself into a woman, which is how the Scandal of Bohemia is. If you look at the Scandal in Bohemia, one of the most famous Sherlock Holmes stories, the main character, the woman, Irene Adler, and Holmes actually never see each other as themselves. They're always in another person's character. With Holmes is either going to be as a best man and as a cleric, and Irene Adler is dressed as a man when Holmes sees her face-to-face outside. So it's kind of interesting how they kind of do things with costumes. But also, I find that Doyle, in his writings, took from other people's literature, and he kind of reworked it. So the first story, A Study in Scarlet, is actually a tribute to Nathaniel Hawthorne's The Scarlet Letter, and that is why certain parts of Holmes's personality are the way they are. Like Holmes plays the violin, but in Nathaniel Hawthorne's story, he says a well-played violin is a treat for the gods. Of course, Doyle repeats those words in his own story, saying a well-played fiddle is a treat for the gods. So it's one of the reasons why Holmes plays the violin. And he also makes sure that Sherlock Holmes is talking about Trichinopoly tobacco, because that comes from Salem, India, as opposed to Salem, Massachusetts, which is where Nathaniel Hawthorne. So he's really clever with everything he does, and that part of Arthur Conan Doyle's existence of how he wrote is something that we do in Doyle's World. We show what he is able to come up with.
That is wild, and it's one of the many things about this book that makes it so interesting. Sherlock Holmes' methods, they're often described as scientific. How did Doyle's own background, of which you just described, and his exposure to medical and forensic training shape Holmes's investigative techniques in the stories?
Okay, this is a great question, because you can bring this into either his own medical questioning, and then you can actually apply it to other things. So, as we said, Doyle did a lot of medical research. He worked with William Rutherford in his clandestine vivisection lab. He really learned scientific principles. And then when you look at things like in the Hound of the Baskervilles, Doyle's kind of using Sherlock Holmes as a vehicle. He's saying, when I do my investigative research, I just don't, dive headfirst into things. I really check everything. I go in there as a cynic and a skeptic, and you have to prove to me why I shouldn't be. You have to show me the real evidence. That also is something that he did in his real life with spiritualism. He did all these paranormal scientific experiments into telepathy, mind reading, parapsychology. He had this guy, Henry Ball, who was the architect of his own home, who claimed he could read Doyle's thoughts. And when Doyle would draw things onto paper, Ball would say he secreted his thoughts to me, and I could see these little circles or squares or squiggly lines. Just so you know, their work is 50 years before tools like Zener cards came out, which were used to study extrasensory perception. So, and to me, that always reminds me of the scene in Ghostbusters when they take out the Zener cards and they're trying to read them. And he also really went out of his way to communicate with the dead and to show that his methods weren't just, out of nowhere. He really was very scientific in his approach. He wanted to show you that he was looking for things that were fake, and he took all of that out. The same way Sherlock Holmes is looking for little things that show you that that's not the way of doing things. So he combines his own research into either medical or into the spiritual, and he shows you when he's doing in the Sherlock Holmes stories, that's what he's thinking. I mean, he's done it also in the Sussex Vampire, where he says, people think it's a vampire that's going to attack this child, and he says, no. That's irrational. We keep irrational thoughts out of here unless we can prove it.
Well, since you mentioned that, right? Since you mentioned the rational aspect of Holmes's deductive reasoning, why do you think Doyle, despite his own scientific background, was so drawn to the supernatural and spiritualism? Did that ever creep into Holmes's logical world?
Well, it did, but you got to remember, as I said, Doyle grew up in a very bizarre childhood. He had a household where science, logic, and the supernatural were not only tolerated, but they were embraced. I mean, you got a picture of a home where chemistry experiments were being carried out in one room, and then there would be a ghost hunt actively underway in another. I mean, that's where he grew up. I mean, his father, Charles Doyle, very talented artist and draftsman. He had a great job, very respected, but he told people he could communicate with birds and fairies. And he said he could see fairies because his mind was able to tune into the world's harmonic frequencies. That's Doyle's father. Not only was that his father, his uncle Richard Doyle, who actually had the cover for Punch magazine for like 100 years, very well-respected illustrator in his own right. He also said, I see fairies and mystical creatures, and when I'm drawing them onto my artwork, I'm not just drawing out of, fantasy. I see that person. I see the fairy. I see the elf. So that's his upbringing. It's no doubt that he would have been telling people, I see this, I can combine imagination with reality. And that's kind of like combining Sherlock Holmes's razor-sharp, reasoning skills with his attraction to the unexplainable.
Sure.
And that's the character he created. It just makes such perfect sense.
Without giving away too much of your book, why do you think Doyle killed off Sherlock Holmes, and why did he end up bringing him back?
Oh, my God, this is a great question. The personal tragedies can do this to you. And when he was 30 years old, he was bombarded with them. Like the toppling of dominoes, his sister died, his best friend George died, 3 of his uncles died, his father dies in a mental hospital. And then, right after all this happens, his wife gets diagnosed with terminal tuberculosis. I mean, you got to picture these blows left him severely depressed. So what do? For him, instead of turning to traditional religion, he seeks out the realm of the dead. He goes to spiritualism. It offered him a way to confront his grief and to believe that there was something more to life than just this physical world. So that was his way of really dealing with these deaths. He said, you know what? I'm going to do something symbolic. I'm going to do something, I'm going to do a symbolic sacrifice. I'm going to pay a tribute to all my family members that died. I'm going to kill Sherlock Holmes.
Wow.
But then again, as I mentioned before, Doyle did dabble in, experimentation with spiritualism and parapsychology. So think about it this way. Could killing Holmes have been, in Arthur Conan's mind, a way of championing the cause of spiritualism? Maybe he plunged Holmes into Reichenbach Falls because not only did it leave him free to do other things, but it left a void that was so profound that his devoted readers found themselves adrift, lost without their brilliant detective. So what do? You rally, you petition Doyle, say, please bring back our iconic hero, which is something you do when you're a spiritualist. Please let me get a message from the dead. It was as if he was asking his fans, I need you to go plead to God to get your loved one back. And you have to almost do a mini seance in your own mind. If you want to get my character back, you have to plead. You have to, bring him back somehow. And what they did, they started to take things into their own hands. They started making their own little parodies and pastiches and magazine articles in an attempt to reestablish a connection with Holmes. They were like mediums. They sought to summon him from the realm of the dead, to hear his voice once more, to walk alongside the character in a new narrative. So that's what I think happened here. Now, 9 years later, so everybody's deaths have been done. He's actually able to reconcile himself. He falls in love again. He gets remarried. He does his thing where he goes off to Bloemfontein in South Africa and joins the war effort. And he sees, soldiers confronting death on a daily basis. And for him, I think he said, okay, it's time. I can do this too. I can reconcile myself too. I can bring back my character. But in the meantime, he also reestablishes this thing where people were looking for things and they would believe that they could talk to their lost loved ones. And again, spiritualism is now being echoed in the community, and really it took off at this time in the early 1900s. That's really when this movement really took off in England.
This episode is brought to you by Principles. Are there limits to the U.S. government's debt growth? What will happen if the debts are not curtailed? What should policymakers or investors do? Those are urgent questions that legendary investor and New York Times bestselling author Ray Dalio addresses in his new book, How Countries Go Broke: The Big Cycle. The book comes out in June and is available for pre-order today, wherever books are sold.
Still getting around to that fix on your car? You got this. On eBay, you'll find millions of parts guaranteed to fit. Doesn't matter if it's a major engine repair or your first time swapping your windshield wipers. eBay has that part you need, ready to click perfectly into place for changes big and small. Loud or quiet, find all the parts you need at prices you'll love. Guaranteed to fit every time. But you already know that. eBay. Things, people, love. Eligible items only. Exclusions apply.
Experience a progressive lens engineered with AI from Essilor, powered by individual measurements of your visual behavior. A lens personalized to you by an Essilor expert. Discover Verilux XR Track and enjoy instantly sharp vision in motion and seamless transitions from near to far. Find your local Essilor expert today at Essilor.com.
Nurses, are you tired of spending weeks or even months finding the perfect job that matches your specialty with your ideal shift and salary? LinkedIn has improved your job search experience. Search by specialty, the shift you want to work, and the salary you want to make. Go to linkedin.com/nurses and begin searching today. That's linkedin.com/nurses.
Note, side effects may include less time finding the perfect job, working a shift that you love with a salary that can take you to St. Thomas, Jamaica, and continuous smiling because of how simple this process was.
By the way, we're going to have you back to do a full hour because there's so many more interesting things about this book that I want to delve into. But before I let you go, your book highlights connections between Treasure Island and Doyle stories. Elaborate for a minute, if you can, on the elements that Doyle borrowed from Robert Louis Stevenson.
Yeah, so we were just talking about Nathaniel Hawthorne before. So that was the first story. The second story, A Sign of the Four, is a tribute to Robert Louis Stevenson from beginning to end. The story opens up at the Wigmore Street post office, basically, and everybody can understand, the biographers and experts of Sherlock Holmes, why he would do such a thing. Well, if you look into it, Cavendish Square is the opening sequence of the strange case of Hyde and Dr. Jekyll. So it pays tribute to that. He has the character Jonathan Small, Doyle, that's his character, but Robert Louis Stevenson has Long John, names that are kind of the same but opposite. He has, his adventure is Doyle's that is on land that goes out to sea, while Stevenson's is the exact opposite. The names of the character Tonga is a tribute to Robert Louis Stevenson's final resting place, which is on Samoa, which is the island next door is Tonga. So all the names you see, the places that you go to, the treasure. So in Treasure Island, they're looking for buried treasure. In Doyle's story, the treasure is actually found in an attic above ground, but it's still jewels. But one of them is in a metal chest, another is in a wooden chest. Everything very similar, but a little bit different. Again, Doyle is a genius, and he really pays tribute. And that's his own story. He didn't really kind of take word for word. He modernized it, and he made a great piece of literature that really stands by itself to himself, his own.
I got to run. I'm way late here. Let me just ask you this question, and maybe you can answer it with a yes or no. A lot of literary critics argue that Holmes and his character and the stories about Holmes overshadowed Doyle's broader body of work. Do you think his non-Holmes writings deserve more recognition?
Yes.
All right. Well, Dan Friedman, I hope everybody checks out Doyle's World. And if you're willing, in the next week or two, I'd love to have you back and we can have an expanded conversation about this.
Oh, I really appreciate that. Thank you so much, Frank. Thank you.
Thank you. If you want to comment on any portion of our conversation, you're welcome to give me a call, 646-720-0635. That's 646-720-0635. This is The Other Side of Midnight. Straight ahead.